Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are starting our discussion of the lecture lesson about the spinal cord. To help us prepare for this lesson and to prepare for the lab final exam, we started with our groups, reminding ourselves of some of the anatomy of the spinal cord. So we're going to start with identifying, we mentioned this before we went to groups, identifying the structure that helps us tell the front versus the back when we're looking at the spinal cord. Remind me again in the chat, what's the name of the structure that we always use when we look at a model or look at a picture to help us know where the back side of the spinal cord is? Yeah, so it's this structure right here, the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion, or I'm going to abbreviate it DRG because that's a lot easier to type. That word dorsal, by the way, what does that word dorsal mean? The dorsal root ganglion is on the dorsal side. Yeah, the dorsal side is the posterior side in our technical anatomy terms, or if we want to put it in easy person words, the back side, right? So the dorsal root ganglion is a bump that I find inside my dorsal root. Now the terminology root, we have a dorsal root and a ventral root. Remember that when we were talking about the spinal cord, roots are the things that attach directly to the spinal cord. My roots come together to form a spinal nerve, but those roots are those things that go into the two sides of the spinal cord. So when I'm looking at my spinal nerves here and I can see the roots, I'm going to have my friends here in class. Can you use the pencil up above my pointer here and circle for me where the dorsal root ganglia are? Where I find that dorsal root ganglion? Yeah, there we go. So we're pointing out absolutely correctly that here on this particular root, there's an area where it's larger, where there's kind of more of a bump. And the same thing over here, you can see that there's a bump here on the back side of this root. That's the thing that we call the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion, DRG. Every time I sit down to look at a spinal cord model, that's the first thing I'm looking for, because I need to know where the posterior side is or where the dorsal side is. See, this bump is on the dorsal root. So here is my dorsal root, this structure right here. And this right here is my other dorsal root on the back side of the spinal cord. So my part here then that's on the other side, that's on the front side, is going to be that ventral root, the ventral root. Dorsal root and ventral root, they fuse together to make a spinal nerve. That's what I see here. That's what I see here. The dorsal root is bringing things into the spinal cord. That means that it's bringing stuff into what's called the dorsal gray horn. So the dorsal gray horn is the one here on the back side, dorsal gray horn, or the dorsal horn, same thing. That's going to make this one called what? What am I going to call this one here? Oh, we're questioning. Yep, there we go. The one in the back is the dorsal one. The one in the front is the ventral one. So the ventral gray horn, or the ventral horn. And over here on the sides, what's my anatomy word for on the side? Yeah, lateral. So my lateral horns over there on the side, lateral horns. The only thing that we haven't labeled are what we call the white matter funiculi in lab. But remember, in lecture, we're just going to call them tracks because we all like English better, I think. Maybe not. If you like funiculi, knock yourself out. But white matter tracks or white matter funiculi, you can label those anywhere in the white matter of the spinal cord. We're going to talk about either today or we'll talk about it next time. The idea that everywhere inside the white matter of the spinal cord, we have these tracks that are kind of like super highways. They send information up to the brain really quickly, or they send information down to the rest of the body really quickly. That's the job of tracks. So anywhere where I have the lighter white matter of the spinal cord, any of those places we would say are where we find white matter tracks or white matter funiculi. Now that we've named our structures, we need to go through and identify where we find specific kinds of neurons. Now, the descriptions that we see over here, these are our functional classifications of neurons, meaning we're classifying them based on their job. Some of the neurons that I would see in this picture are what we call interneurons. Before we talk about the location of interneurons, can you remind me in the chat, what's the job of interneurons? What do interneurons do? Yeah, interneurons are my processing neurons. They're my, like Tierney said, our technical word for it is my integrator neurons. They're the ones that are going to figure out what we're trying to say or where we're supposed to say it, basically. Interneurons are my processing neurons. When we talk about the job of a sensory neuron, what's the job of a sensory neuron? What does that kind of neuron do? Yeah, I like the word that Nicole used there. She used the word detect. Absolutely. A sensory neuron is a neuron that's going to detect what's happening, or it's going to collect information. Sensory neurons collect information, or they detect what's happening. Interneurons process it or integrate it, and they figure out what response we should have. If we should have a response with our smooth muscles. Remember, smooth muscles are found inside hollow organs, like the digestive tract, like blood vessels. That's where I find what are called autonomic motor neurons, or sometimes we call them visceral motor neurons. Visceral means we're inside an organ. So sometimes my processor says, yeah, we need to make your stomach churn. You just ate some food. Sometimes my integrator says, we need to activate the muscles in your hand because we're trying to take notes. The kind of motor neurons that would activate those muscles are what we call somatic motor neurons, meaning they control skeletal muscles. Each of these different functional types of neurons live in different places. Let's start with some of the ones that we for sure talked about in lab. I'm going to mark here on my picture. Oh no, let's start over. Mark on my picture, we talked about the horns. This one back here is my dorsal horn. This one over here is my lateral horn. This one up here is my ventral horn. Which of these three horns, dorsal, lateral, or ventral, which of these is the place where I find neurons that control skeletal muscle? Do we remember from lab? Where do those ones live? We're torn. Yeah, so when we talk about the location of skeletal muscle controlling neurons, the ones that help you do movement, they start in the ventral gray horn. So we're going to call them somatic motor neurons, if I can spell. Somatic motor neurons. Now someone mentioned this is where those neurons start. So I'm going to draw, we get to draw a neuron together today. I'm going to draw a neuron here with its little dendrites here, cell body. This is where that somatic motor neuron starts, and then its axon goes out and leaves. So here are its little axon terminals at the end. A somatic motor neuron, its cell body starts in the ventral horn, and then its axon leaves through that ventral root to go out where it's going, to go out to skeletal muscle, for example. Right next door to where my somatic motor neuron lives, right next door in the lateral horn is where I'm going to find the cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. My ones that control smooth muscle, so my ones that control your organs, for example. The lateral horn is where we have what are called visceral motor neurons. Visceral motor neurons, or to use our lab word, autonomic motor neurons. The cell bodies of the neurons would go here, and then their axons would run out here through the ventral root. So it's absolutely right that motor information goes out through the ventral root because my cell bodies start in the horns and then they send their axons out of the body. Here in the dorsal horn, I have the cell bodies of which kind of neuron? Who lives back here? Do we remember? Yeah, so the dorsal horn is the location where I find the cell body of my processing neurons. My processing neurons live back here. Let me try to draw us one here. My processing neurons live back here. They receive information and they send that information to the correct motor neurons. So here's my interneuron that's receiving information, it's processing it, and then it sends that information either to a somatic motor neuron that does skeletal muscle, or to a visceral motor neuron that would control smooth muscle inside organs. So that brings us to one more thing to label, which is sensory neurons. Does anyone happen to remember, where would I find the cell body for a sensory neuron? Yeah, so sensory neurons are a little bit funky. Sensory neurons, their axon is coming in through the dorsal root. Their dendrites are extending out into the body. Their cell body lives in that thing called the dorsal root ganglion. I know my picture's terrible, I apologize. But their cell body lives out here in this bump. That's why there's a bump on the dorsal root, because I've got cell bodies of my sensory neurons. They collect information out here and they send that information straight in through that dorsal root and give it to the interneurons that are in the dorsal horn. The interneurons process that information, figure out what to do with it, and they could send it to a visceral motor neuron to do something with your organs, or a somatic motor neuron to do something with your skeletal muscles. Either way, depending on, regardless of who they send it to, that information is going to go out the ventral horn, out into the body. So this is a little bit tricky because we're going to do an application thing here in a moment. Technically speaking, sensory neurons do not live in the spinal cord. When I say live for a neuron, I'm meaning that it's where their cell body's found. So technically speaking, a sensory neuron does not live in the spinal cord. Sensory neurons live in the dorsal root ganglion. They send information in to the dorsal horn with their axon terminals, but their cell bodies out here in the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal horn is where interneurons live, the ventral horn and the lateral horn where my two types of motor neurons live. Yeah, so Nicole asked a question about our interneurons. She asked if the interneurons, any part of them leaves the spinal cord. The answer to that question is no. They are always going to talk to some kind of motor neuron. So an interneuron might talk to a visceral motor or a somatic motor neuron, but an interneuron is never going to leave the spinal cord. It's always going to connect with somebody else to get things done. Yeah, so then Jacqueline asked a question about our interneurons, which kinds of sensory information they collect, they process. They process the two kinds of sensory information too. So I will address that question a little bit more thoroughly when I pull up our picture that shows them. But the short answer to your question, Jacqueline, is that they can process both kinds of sensory information. Different interneurons process each kind of sensory information. Apologize, my little one I think he's probably hungry. All right, before we talk a little more specifically about those different types of interneurons and the motor neurons, I want to remind us that when you look at the spinal cord, the white matter of the spinal cord is found on the outside. The gray matter of the spinal cord is found in the middle. When we talked about the brain, where was most of the gray matter of the brain found? Where's most of the gray matter when you think about the brain? Is it inside or outside? Where's that gray matter? Yeah, so most of the gray matter for the brain is on the outside, arranged in those things that are called gyri and sulci, right? The bumps and the indentations. We did have, though, that special set of gray matter that was all the way in the middle of the brain. What was the name of that gray matter in the very middle of the brain? It was the things that could malfunction in Parkinson's and Tourette's. Yeah, those things called the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei were the gray matter in the middle of the brain. They were surrounded by the white matter of the brain. In the spinal cord, we've just got white matter on the outside and gray matter in the middle. We don't have that extra layer of gray matter on the outside. If you remember, though, in the brain, remember how we talked about those things like association tracts and commissural tracts and projection tracts? It's the same kind of tracts in the brain that we see here in the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, the tracts are found on the very outside, and they're doing the same thing. They're sending information really quickly. Remind me, when we talked about the gray matter and the white matter, which one had more myelin? Did gray matter or white matter have more myelin? Yeah, the white matter definitely had more myelin, right? Remember, it looks white because it has that myelin, the fatty stuff. And because it has so much myelin, that helps us to know that the part that it has a lot of in that neuron are the axons, the neuron axons. So the tracts in the spinal cord send information very quickly. The gray matter, the horns in the spinal cord, are processing information, or they're integrating information, figuring out what to do in those horns, which, remember, the horns are gray matter. They don't have as much myelin. they're mostly made out of those cell bodies, or they're mostly made out of the dendrites where we receive information. I had to throw in a quick joke here because we just spent some time talking about myelin. They actually make this t-shirt, and one day I hope to own this t-shirt. So it's a joke. It says, you know what gets on my nerves? Myelin. So just a little anatomy humor for you to lighten things up today. Okay, what page do we have this picture on in your notes packets? Okay, perfect. So we're on page 2 of the note packet. In our group work, we already started to kind of talk about this stuff. So that's the good news. We've already done our first pass at this. But let's go more in depth to help us out with identifying which kinds of neurons live in which places in the spinal cord. First thing I will remind us is that we can see our dorsal root ganglion right here in the back. So this bump on the dorsal root is the dorsal root ganglion. That tells me that this is the back side of my spinal cord. My ventral root then coming off of the front side of the spinal cord. When we look at this picture, we have color-coded for us the different kinds of neurons that are found in various places. We talked about how the ventral horn had what were called somatic motor neurons in them, or motor neurons that control skeletal muscle. So motor neurons here that do skeletal muscle, somatic motor neurons. In the lateral horn next door were another type of motor neurons. These motor neurons were called visceral motor neurons. Remember that visceral motor neurons help things to happen in your organs, in your viscera, as we call them together. My 2 motor neurons, you can see in my picture here, their cell bodies start in these 2 horns, and their axons extend out through that ventral root. So remember, for the sake of lab, that the ventral root is where my motor information leaves the spinal cord. My dorsal root is where sensory information comes into the spinal cord. Now, notice that I've got 2 different colors here representing the 2 different kinds of sensory information we can receive in the body. We can receive somatic sensory information. Somatic sensory information is going to come from places like your skin, your muscles, your tendons, those kind of places. That's one kind of sensory information we can get. The other kind of sensory information we can get is visceral sensory information. Pardon my typo there. Visceral sensory information. That's information that's coming from your organs. So information like your stomach is full, or maybe more accurately, your stomach is empty. I'm a little empty stomached over here right now. Things like your bladder is full or empty. Things like, I'm trying to think of some other ones that aren't just full and empty. Things like your blood oxygen is low, perhaps, oxygen low. These are the kinds of things coming from organs. Any information that comes from an organ is going to go back to the spinal cord using a visceral sensory neuron. Now, notice my sensory information is coming in the dorsal root back here, but remember that we said sensory neurons live in the dorsal root ganglion. They take their information into the spinal cord and they synapse with the interneurons that live in the dorsal horn. In the dorsal horn, I have 2 different kinds of interneurons back here. Some of these interneurons that we see here in blue, some of them are really good at interpreting information that comes from your skin, or they're really good at interpreting information that comes from your muscles or your tendons. Those are what we call the somatic interneurons. So interneurons that get information from your body in general, they tend to live a little bit farther back in the dorsal horn. But also in the dorsal horn are interneurons that interpret information that comes from your organs. So your stomach, your lungs, your urinary system, that kind of sensory information is sent to a slightly different place inside the dorsal horn. But all of the sensory information is sent to interneurons that live in the dorsal horn. Let me type this out because it's like an underline highlight star idea to make sure we know this. Sensory neurons do not live in the spinal cord. Sensory neurons do not live in the spinal cord. You should never tell me a location in the spinal cord for those neurons. The only kind of neurons that live in the dorsal horn are interneurons. Interneurons, my processors. If we're talking about sensory neurons, they live in the dorsal root ganglion. Whether they're a somatic sensory neuron collecting stuff from your skin, or whether they're a visceral sensory neuron collecting stuff from your organs. Yeah, organs like Jekyll mentioned too, it could be the heart. So information from your heart, from your lungs, any of your organ systems that send sensory information back, absolutely going to go to these visceral interneurons. The visceral interneurons process that information, and then they decide which kind of motor neurons should respond. Is this something that we use skeletal muscle to respond to, or is this something that we use smooth muscle or cardiac muscle to respond to? Based on how they interpret that information, they'll activate the correct type of neurons and then send that information out. You have in your lab packet, oops, it formatted funky on my slide here. You have a list of 6 different functions, and we need to figure out the neurons that live in each of the horns. Which horn would be used to do each of these things? What I'm going to do is split us back into groups and give us a chance to work on this. To make sure our recording keeps going, I'm going to say that I'm going to give you 5 minutes to work on this, and then I'm going to pull you back into the room. So I'm not going to check in like I usually do. So in exactly 5 minutes, I'm going to pull us back together. So do your best. Let's work on identifying which kind of neurons are responsible for each of these functions. I will plop this slideshow into your group. So you'll go to slide number 7 in this slideshow that I'm going to share with you. So here come the groups. Go to slide number 7 so you can work through these questions here. For my friends on the recording, we will restart in about 5 minutes. So it's going to be silent here in the recording for about 4 or 5 minutes. Feel free to zoom ahead to when we start our session again.
package.
All right, bringing us back together. Fingers crossed everything stayed good with the recording. It said it kept recording, so we'll see. When we talk about various functions that our body needs to do, there are things as basic as doing things like getting your heart rate set, to things a little more complex perhaps, like moving your fingers or processing temperature sensations. We worked with our groups to try to predict which kinds of neurons do each of these things here on the list. So we're going to go one by one through the various functions that different neurons might help us to do. When we talk about setting your heart rate, we need to remember what kind of muscle is found in the heart. What kind of muscle lives in the heart? Yeah, the heart is made out of cardiac muscle. And I probably should have been a little more specific when I was talking about those visceral motor neurons. Visceral motor, most of what it controls is smooth muscle because that's what we have the most of in the body. Visceral motor neurons also, though, control cardiac muscle. So when we're talking about doing something like setting your heart rate or telling your cardiac muscle when to contract, that's going to be the job of visceral motor neurons. Do we remember which part of the spinal cord did visceral motor neurons live in? Where do visceral motor neurons live in? Yeah, they were the ones in the lateral gray horn. The lateral gray horn. So the ones that live on the lateral side are the ones that would do functions like setting your heart rate, controlling the contraction of your cardiac muscle. Next, we have the process of determining or processing how full your stomach is. Now, this word processing should be a tip-off for us of the functional type of neuron we're looking for. Big picture, which kind of neurons did we say did processing? Who were my processors? Yeah, my processors are interneurons. So processing is something that an interneuron does. Interneurons are processors. So to answer Jacqueline's question, whenever we're talking about interneurons, my processors, all kinds of interneurons, all live in the same place. Which part of the spinal cord did all of my interneurons live in? Yeah, all of the interneurons live together in the dorsal gray horn. All interneurons live in the dorsal gray horn. Now, they don't all get the same kind of information. They don't all process the same kind of information. This particular neuron, because it's processing information from your organs, we would say that it's processing visceral sensory information. So I'm going to call it a visceral interneuron, just for our own reference here. This one would be considered a visceral interneuron because it's processing information from an organ. Because we also had another processor. This processor was doing temperature information. Temperature information is the kind of information that a somatic interneuron would process, a somatic interneuron. So somatic sensations from anywhere in the body. Even though it's processing a different type of information, because it's a processor, it still lives in the dorsal gray horn. This is still going to be in the dorsal gray horn because it's a processor of information. We skipped one right here. We skipped the one that helps you with moving your fingers. When we talk about moving your fingers, which kind of muscle do we have in our fingers? What's the muscle in our fingers? Yeah, your fingers are moved using skeletal muscle. So we are looking for the type of neuron that would control skeletal muscle. So the type of neuron that controls skeletal muscle is what we call a somatic motor neuron, a somatic motor neuron because it's doing skeletal muscle. Which part of the spinal cord did somatic motor neurons live inside of? Where were those skeletal muscle neurons found in? Yeah, those ones were found in the ventral gray horn on the front side, the ventral gray horn. Down below, we've got a mention here of regulating blood pressure. The blood pressure in your body is caused by the contraction or the relaxation of the type of muscle that we find inside blood vessels. Which kind of muscle lives inside blood vessels? Yeah, smooth muscle is inside blood vessels. So when we talk about regulating blood pressure, we're regulating the contraction of smooth muscle. So again, we're looking at a visceral motor neuron because it's doing smooth muscle. Again, we're going to find this in a neuron that lives in the lateral gray horn. The lateral gray horn. So when we're talking about something like your blood pressure, when we're talking about something like your heart rate, when we're talking about making your stomach or your intestines contract, all of those kinds of functions are things that are regulated by neurons or controlled by neurons that live in the lateral gray horn. When we talk about something like moving skeletal muscle, moving your fingers, your toes, your torso, all of that is functions that neurons in the ventral gray horn do. Our last task down here is detecting texture sensations. When I use this word detecting, which kind of neuron are we talking about now when we're saying detecting? Yeah, so now we're talking about a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron. Those are the type that do detecting. Where did we say that sensory neurons live? Where do sensory neurons live? Yep. So full disclosure, Dr. Ellis specifically and purposely went tricky on you here. Sensory neurons live in the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. They do not live inside the spinal cord. They're not inside the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, the ventral horn. They live outside the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion. So anytime you see this task of detecting, we're thinking it's a sensory neuron, and we're remembering those ones don't live in the spinal cord. They live outside the spinal cord. They would give that information to our neurons that live in the dorsal gray horn, where they would process it and figure out how we should respond. How do we feel about this learning activity? Thumbs up, thumbs down. What questions do we still have? so. Yeah, so my hint for you as you're working through these activities, think about what kind of thing in the body we are controlling, or think about what kind of information we're processing that might help you figure out where we are in the spinal cord. Looking at Jacqueline's question here. So you're talking about motor neurons, Jacqueline, somatic and visceral only? So here to address Nicole's question, Nicole asked about the word somatic. Technically what somatic means is of the body. Of the body, it's a general term. So we have somatic motor neurons, we have somatic sensory neurons. Somatic, when we think about it with senses, think about it kind of like general sensory information. Somatic, when you think about it with motor, think about it as skeletal muscle. So of the body, let's type this. If we have somatic sensory information, that's going to mean general senses, touch, temperature, stretching. When we talk about somatic motor information, that's going to mean skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. Okay, so I'm looking at your question, Jacqueline. Yeah, in general, when we talk about motor neurons and sensory neurons, excuse me, they will either be visceral or somatic. Those are the only two options that we have. There's no other kind. Sorry about that. I paused my mic because I was coughing there. So here, let's do a whiteboard. Maybe that'll help us here. Here's my options in the body. I have somatic sensory neurons. I have visceral sensory neurons. Both of these kinds of neurons each have their own interneurons that they talk to. Interneurons figure out, or they process the sensory information they receive, and they will either activate a somatic motor neuron or a visceral motor neuron. Let's fill in some information for ourselves here. We're going to start with our somatic motor neurons up here. If a somatic motor neuron gets activated, what did we say were the things that a somatic motor neuron controls? Who's this going to talk to? Yeah, Gloria's right there. If I activate a somatic motor neuron, it's going to go talk to skeletal muscle tissue, and it's going to make you have some kind of body movement, a body movement of some sort. Because a somatic motor neuron goes out to the body, that's what somatic means, of the body. It goes out to the body, talks to skeletal muscle tissue, and causes your body to move. Because that's the job of skeletal muscle tissue, to give you movement. So every time I activate a somatic motor neuron, I'm going to do some kind of movement, some kind of body movement. Visceral motor neurons talk to two kinds of muscle tissue. What did we say the two kinds of muscle tissue were that visceral motor neurons talk to? There's two kinds that they can talk to. Who do they talk to? Yeah, one of them they talk to is smooth muscle tissue, and the other one that they talk to is cardiac muscle tissue. So when we have a message, meaning that we need to activate something that has smooth muscle, so this is going to be most of your body's organs are made of smooth muscle. It's going to be those blood vessels. If we need to increase or decrease your blood pressure by making the blood vessels bigger or smaller, I would use a visceral motor neuron to do that. If we needed our intestines to start churning because we just ate something, I would use a visceral motor neuron to do that. Or if I wanted to change how quickly my heart was beating or how strong it was beating, I would use a visceral motor neuron to do that as well. So changing the activity of organs, including the heart, that's the kind of thing that a visceral motor neuron can do. Making your body move, that's the kind of thing that a somatic motor neuron can do. Because these two types of motor neurons talk to different things. If we go back to our sensory neurons, these sensory neurons, regardless of whether visceral or somatic, they're still always collecting information, but they collect different kinds of information. So a somatic sensory neuron is going to collect general sensory information, but it's going to collect it from places like the skin, places like the muscles, the tendons, kind of general body structures. So again, information like pain, stretching, temperature, that's the kind of stuff that a somatic sensory neuron collects from places like your skin, your muscles, your tendons. When we start collecting information from your organs, that's the kind of information that a visceral sensory neuron would collect. Again, it's still going to be things like stretching, so how full is your stomach? It's still going to be some of that other kinds of sensory information like temperature or movements, those kind of things. That same kind of information is still collected by visceral sensory information, but they're collecting it from the organs and not from the skin or the muscles or the tendons. I know Jacqueline said maybe that cleared things up for her a little bit more. What other questions do we have? Yeah, go for it, Gloria.
So just real quick, are the interneurons in the middle because it goes to the sensory neurons and the somatic motor neuron? Or why is that there?
So we collect sensory information with these sensory neurons. The sensory neurons can't do anything with that information. So they actually then, the sensory neurons would send their information to the interneurons. The interneurons would process it and say, oh, I feel like my muscles are too stretched out. I'm going to tell a somatic neuron to contract or stop contracting so that that muscle isn't so stretched out.
Oh.
Or a sensory neuron detects that, oh, my stomach is full of food, sends that information to the neuron, or the interneuron. The interneuron says, oh, well, what we need to do then is we need to start churning the stomach so that we can process it and push that food through. So we didn't really talk much about the interneurons, but all they do is they take whatever kind of sensory information comes in and they send it to the correct kind of motor neuron to respond to it correctly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it, Jacqueline. So my interneurons are my processors. They figure out what needs to move or how something needs to move, and then making that movement happen, either the whole body or some part of the body, some organ in the body, that's the job of the motor neurons, correct. And the motor neurons, so they're not both in the ventral horn. My somatic motor neurons were the ones in the ventral horn. My visceral motor neurons were the ones in the lateral horn. So depending on exactly which kind of movements we're doing, whether it's an organ or whether it's the whole body, that's going to determine which of these horns that we use. Interneurons are always in the dorsal horn, and my sensory neurons are always in the dorsal root ganglion. So location-wise, sensory is always found in the dorsal root ganglion. Interneurons are always found in the dorsal horn. Different kinds of motor neurons in each of those types of horns of the spinal cord. I feel like we are feeling that it's the end of the semester. We're a little bit draggy today. Definitely. Let's have a quick emoji fest. It doesn't have to be how you're feeling. Just find an emoji that you like and send it to me. Go for it, Nicole.
Can you go back to the slide that had the where the color coded where it was coming in and out?
Yes, let me pull that up.
I have a question on that because I'm just trying to connect it in my brain.
Here we go.
So I'm sorry, the visceral is in the lateral, and that's the one when you're up at the top up here, that's these blue ones.
Nope, these ones up here are my interneurons. So here's the dorsal horn.
But I mean they're the neurons that collect the information that gets sent to the visceral, right?
So I'm not going to be specific about the part of the dorsal horn where visceral sensory information goes to. Okay. Technically, the visceral information is going to go a little bit more toward the ventral side. So see how over here they have it labeled visceral sensory right here? This is technically where sensory information from your organs goes to. Technically, sensory information from your skin goes back a little bit farther, but we're just going to consider the interneurons as a whole here in the dorsal horn. There are technically, though, different places that we send the sensory information to, kind of like how we had the homunculus in the brain, right? Similar kind of thing where I send general sensory information from the body more toward the back and sensory information from my organs a little bit more toward the front. I don't care about that distinction. I care about this distinction, lateral versus ventral. Make sure that we know where the different motor neurons live. You can or can't know where those different interneurons live. I don't think you should waste your time on it, honestly. But if you want to, if it helps you understand, please do. Yeah, Jacqueline's like, yeah, no. Don't learn more than we have to, right? Yeah, so I'm struggling to come up with another way to describe it for you, Nicole. I'm not a huge fan of exactly the way that they color coded the picture. So what I'll say is this blue neuron that I see coming in back here, this blue neuron has information from your skin. This is my somatic sensory neuron back here in blue. This neuron is synapsing with the interneurons that live in the back part of the dorsal horn. These are interneurons because now we're in the dorsal horn. They're getting information from a somatic sensory neuron that I find back here. So this one back here is a somatic sensory neuron sending information to my interneurons that live here in the back part of the spinal cord, in the back part of the dorsal horn. This neuron right here in green is a visceral sensory neuron collecting information from your stomach, for example. When the visceral sensory neuron comes into the dorsal horn, it's going to talk to interneurons that live a little bit closer to the front. Everybody who lives inside here is always interneurons. My sensory neurons that collect different kinds of sensory information, though, they're going to talk to different groups of interneurons. So if you collect information from the skin, you talk to the interneurons in the back part of the gray horn. If you collect sensory information from the organs, you talk to the interneurons that live in the front part of the dorsal gray horn. So all of these are interneurons. It's all about who they're talking to help them process the information correctly. Yeah, here, I'll pop off that mic. Were we able to catch that information? Is there anything that I need to repeat back? I know there was an echo. Okay.
Okay, so just know that the sensory info collected and detected in the dorsal root ganglion, right? Which then goes to the dorsal gray horn where the inner neurons are, and the inner neurons process and predict, right, the response. That will either go to the lateral gray horn or the somatic motor neuron in the ventral horn, depending on if it's controlling smooth muscle and cardiac or if it's skin and muscle, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And then either way, all of it will travel out to make motor movement happen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All the sensory stuff comes in the back. All the motor stuff goes out the front. Different kinds of motor directions come from different places, but they all always leave together out the front. Absolutely. So I believe there are some practice questions on the homework assignment that ask you to keep considering which kinds of neurons would do these kinds of functions. In case there isn't practice activities in the homework, know that you will definitely have some test questions that are like this. So make sure we're reviewing the kinds of jobs that neurons that live in different places can do. That's kind of an important idea from this lesson here. Let's talk about reflexes. So reflexes are one of those things that I want you, rather than memorizing, I want you to learn how to think your way through. So we're going to spend the rest of our class today learning how to think our way through reflexes so that we don't have to memorize them. When we talk about reflexes, the first thing for you to know about any of these reflexes is that reflexes are automatic. Automatic, meaning that you don't have to think about this happening. It happens all on its own. And in fact, it happens so quickly, you don't have a chance to process the information before you respond to it. So when I say it's automatic, there's no conscious processing. You're not making it happen, and it happens really fast. That's what I mean when I talk about it being automatic. With each of these reflexes, there are some ways that we classify them to help us know things about them. So we're going to look at specific reflexes to help us understand some of the most important terminology. So when we talk about reflexes, I guess I'm missing one picture that you have from your packet. But whenever we talk about a reflex, let's do whiteboard. I get to draw for you again. When we talk about a reflex, there are three parts. My neurons just keep getting better and better, right? All right, so out here in your picture, you've got some skin with a nail in it. Ouch. And then we've got our dorsal root ganglion with the little neuron. We come into the spinal cord. Here's the spinal cord. And we've got our horns. Let's trade colors. Here are the horns. Okay. When we talk about a reflex arc, 3 parts. And again, this is from page 3 of your packet. It looks way better in your packet. 3 parts to a reflex arc. We start with our sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is what detects something, detects a stimulus. For every reflex arc we're going to talk about, you need to know the stimulus, the thing that makes your body respond automatically. So in this case, it's when we prick ourselves with a push pin or when we step on a nail. That's my stimulus. That's detected by my sensory neuron. My sensory neuron takes that information to the second part of a reflex arc, which are those interneurons. And you've already told me several times the job of an interneuron is to process. So I send that information to the processing neuron, the second neuron. That second neuron then uses a motor neuron to send the response out to the body. When we talk about reflexes, we can have both somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes or autonomic reflexes. Again, it's going to come down to what we're activating in the body. Are we activating smooth muscle? Are we activating skeletal muscle? But that's always the third part of a reflex arc, those motor neurons. So let's go back to our first reflex and we'll just talk our way through the reflexes and how to know things about them. Here's our first reflex. The first one is called the patellar reflex. So the patellar reflex is what I would call a monosynaptic reflex. This beginning part, mono, right here, does anyone know what mono stands for? Monosynaptic? Yeah, mono means one. So monosynaptic, if I have a reflex that is monosynaptic, that means it has one synapse. One synapse. A synapse is a place where a neuron talks to another neuron. Most of your reflexes in the body are what we call polysynaptic. Polysynaptic. Polysynaptic means there's more than one. Pretty much the only monosynaptic reflex that you're going to learn is the patellar reflex. So in the patellar reflex, which is a monosynaptic reflex, this is what we use to kick our doctor. When they tap your knee and you kick them out of pure rage, right? That's the patellar reflex. So the way the patellar reflex works is we have a sensory neuron that's down here inside our quadriceps muscles, so multiple muscles here in your knee. The doctor hits your patellar tendon that helps to hold the patella in place. When they tap on that, it stretches these muscles. These muscles detect that stretching and send that information into the spinal cord. Now, the patellar reflex is a monosynaptic reflex, meaning that sensory information actually isn't processed at all. We just synapse directly with a motor neuron, causing us to do muscle contraction. When we have a monosynaptic reflex, there is no interneuron. No interneuron. We go straight from a sensory neuron into a motor neuron. We do zero processing. That's why the patellar reflex is so fast, because there's no processing. So when you look at every reflex, one of the first things we're going to look at is how many neurons are in that reflex, or how many synapses do I see in that reflex? If I just have two neurons, so I have one synapse where they meet with each other, that would be a monosynaptic reflex. In my other ones, as we'll see here in a moment, if I have more than one synapse, two or more synapses, I'm always going to have an interneuron. There's going to be another neuron involved. Yeah, Christina asked about this neuron back here. This neuron is a great example of a unipolar neuron. Absolutely. See how I've got the cell body and it has one little extension on it? If you remember from lab, we said that sensory neurons are unipolar neurons. So absolutely right. We've got a unipolar sensory neuron that's synapsing directly with my motor neuron. This is a monosynaptic reflex. Next thing that we need to know about reflexes. So here's my first set of words. Monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Do you have one synapse, meaning you have just two neurons, or do you have more than one synapse, which means we're going to have three or more neurons? That's my first thing. Second thing I need to know about reflexes is if they are cranial or sacral. Cranial or sacral is the terminology that I use to help me figure out where I do integration. Where I do integration. That's where I process the synapse. Here's the good news. This aspect of a reflex is super, super easy. Or not sacral. I apologize, Jacqueline. You're totally right. Need more coffee. It's supposed to be cranial or spinal. So sorry. I was kicking into autonomic nervous system stuff that we don't care about. Yeah, that was an oops on Dr. Alice. Cranial or spinal? Cranial or spinal. When we classify a reflex as cranial or spinal, it's all about where I'm processing. And this is probably the easiest thing for you to tell when you look at a picture of a reflex. Because if I have a spinal reflex, I will always see the spinal cord. So if you see your reflex arc that looks like this and you see the spinal cord in the middle of it, hey, guess what? That's a spinal reflex. If I see something that's not the spinal cord, then it's going to be a cranial reflex. Cranial reflexes are typically processed in the brain stem. So that's a lab word for us there. The brain stem, that's things like the pons and the medulla and the midbrain. I'm never going to ask you which particular part of the brain stem a reflex is processed in. All you need to know is if you don't see a spinal cord in your reflex arc, that's a cranial reflex. If you see a spinal cord in the picture, that's a spinal reflex. So the patellar reflex is a spinal reflex. That means that we don't have to use the brain or the brain stem at all to process it. It's a monosynaptic reflex, meaning I don't even process at all. I go straight from sensory into motor to make it happen. The final thing we need to know about our reflexes is if they are ipsilateral or contralateral. Did we use these words when we were doing directional terminology? I can't remember if we did. Are these new words? Okay, so these are new words. Okay, well, here's the good news. They're not super hard. Contralateral. Lateral means side. So we've got contralateral and we've got ipsilateral. One of these words means that it's on opposite sides. Do you think that ipsilateral or contralateral would mean opposites? Yeah, exactly. Contralateral means that the effect is on the opposite side. Ipsilateral means the effect is on the same side. I like to remember that because I have a 3-year-old who's very contrarian, right? I propose something and she can never say yes to what I propose. So I can say, let's wear our Ariel shirt today, and she'll say, absolutely not. And I can say, let's wear the Minnie Mouse shirt today. Absolutely not. And then 2 minutes later, she'll say that we'll wear the Ariel shirt today, and then it's okay. But she has to be contrarian. Yeah, she has to contradict me. Absolutely. So if we're talking about a contralateral reflex, we perceive a stimulus on one side of the body, and the other side of the body will also respond to it. When we have an ipsilateral reflex, we're responding on the same side of the body, only one side of the body, the side where the stimulus happened. When we look at a picture of a reflex like the patellar reflex, the doctor hits your, let's see, we're looking at our right leg here. Doctor hits your right leg. That sensory information comes into the spinal cord. That synapses directly with the motor neuron and causes your right leg to kick. Would we say that the patellar reflex is an ipsilateral reflex or a contralateral reflex based on our descriptions here? Yeah, the patellar reflex is going to be an ipsilateral reflex. It would be really creepy if it was contralateral, right? Doctor taps your right leg and you kick them with your left. So an ipsilateral reflex, the side of the spinal cord that the sensory information comes in is the same side of the spinal cord that motor information goes out. With the patellar reflex, here's what we need to know. First thing we need to know about the patellar reflex is that it is a monosynaptic reflex. There is one synapse, one place where a sensory neuron synapses with a motor neuron. Second thing we need to know, the patellar reflex is a spinal reflex. We know this because we see the spinal cord. That's the place where my neurons are synapsing with each other, in the spinal cord. Third thing I need to know about the patellar reflex is that it's an ipsilateral reflex. The side that the sensory information came in is the same side that the motor information comes out. The patellar reflex is monosynaptic, ipsilateral, and spinal. So Gloria asked how we could tell that this particular reflex is a monosynaptic reflex. It comes back to the definition of what monosynaptic means. Monosynaptic means that I have one synapse, means I have one place where neurons talk to each other. Notice in this reflex here, here's my sensory neuron. So my sensory neuron comes in, my sensory neuron goes down and it talks to my motor neuron right here. My motor neuron goes down and talks to the muscle. I have one synapse or one place where neurons are talking to each other. That makes this a monosynaptic reflex. One place where I go from one neuron to another. Otherwise, there's no other synapses going on. Let me show you, Gloria, a picture of a polysynaptic reflex, because maybe that will help with our understanding. Here's a polysynaptic reflex. So our first classification we're going to use here on this one, polysynaptic reflex. Help me out in the chat. How do I know that this one is a polysynaptic reflex? How can I tell that from this picture? Okay, so Nicole's mentioning that we can see the interneuron in this picture. Here it is right here in the spinal cord, absolutely. And Jesse's mentioning the other way I can tell too. I have two synapses. I have two places where neurons are talking to each other. Let's look at our synapse here, or excuse me, our reflex here. This is called the Flexor withdrawal reflex, also known as you touch something hot and you pull your hand away. Let's be real, right? It's 2020. You just want to feel something, right? Not really. We don't want to feel touching something hot. But If you touch something hot, we detect that with our sensory neuron. So our sensory neuron here in green collects that heat information, that pain information. It goes in through the dorsal root. There's the dorsal root ganglion. Sensory information comes into the dorsal horn, and it synapses with an interneuron in the dorsal horn. One synapse right here, synapse number 1. Interneuron goes to ventral neuron, synapse number 2, where my interneuron is talking to my motor neuron that leaves the spinal cord and goes out down to the muscles, causing your finger, or your whole arm actually, to pull away so that we don't keep burning it. I have 1 and 2 places where neurons talk to each other. If I have 2 synapses, that is a polysynaptic reflex. If you don't want to go through and count synapses, you can always just see the fact that I have an interneuron. With my monosynaptic reflex, there was no interneuron. So if you have an interneuron in any reflex, that means you're polysynaptic. If you don't have an interneuron, then it's a monosynaptic reflex. So Gloria asked the question that the flexor withdrawal reflex has an interneuron. Does that mean that this reflex takes longer? Yes, it does take a little bit longer for us to do this one. Not like crazy longer, not as long as it would take you to consciously process that you're touching something hot. I mean, imagine or think about a time in your life where you accidentally touched a pan or a plate or something that was hot, how quickly you pulled your hand away. It's not quite as quick as how fast your knee would kick when the doctor taps it with their hammer, but it's still pretty quick. So it takes a little bit longer because we do a little bit of processing. It is still a reflex though, so it does still go pretty fast. Okay, first thing about the flexor withdrawal reflex is it's polysynaptic because we have an interneuron, because I have more than 1 synapse. Both of those tell me this is polysynaptic. Second thing we need to know about the flexor withdrawal reflex, is this a cranial or spinal reflex? Which kind of reflex is this one? Yeah, this one is definitely a spinal reflex. How do I know this is a spinal reflex? How can I tell? Yeah, I can see in the middle of my picture, right? In the middle of this reflex, I can see the spinal cord. That means it's a spinal reflex. A lot of things in anatomy are hard, right? But I promise, calling it a spinal reflex is not hard. It's as simple as you think it is. Okay? Last thing we need to know about these reflexes is if they are ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral or contralateral. What do we think? Yeah, this is another example of an ipsilateral reflex. Ipsilateral reflex, meaning it happens on the same side of the body as the response is on the same side of the body as the stimulus was. Sensory information came in and motor information came out, both on the same side of the spinal cord. We'll add to what we know about the flexor withdrawal reflex that the stimulus or the thing that makes this reflex happen is pain. Anytime you receive too much of some kind of sensation, if it is too hot, your body registers that as pain, and pain is the sensory information that goes back to the spinal cord that I give to this interneuron, and the interneuron says, I don't like this. We need to make movement happen so we're not in pain anymore. So the stimulus for the flexor withdrawal reflex is pain. The reason you use your flexor muscles to pull away your finger is because you're in pain, because it hurts. The flexor withdrawal reflex. I think we mentioned this before, but I'll say it just to make sure we know. With the patellar reflex, my stimulus, the thing that made that happen, was stretching. So I stretched out that tendon a little bit. That stretching is what tripped the patellar reflex, what made that reflex happen. Yeah, so yep, so it's the stretching that's caused by the hammer tapping that tendon. And remind me again, when we looked at the patellar reflex, was this one monosynaptic or polysynaptic? What was the patellar reflex? Yeah, this one was monosynaptic. Because remember, there's just one place where I connect neurons to each other, monosynaptic. Or if I count my neurons, I only have 1 and 2 of them. There's no interneuron, a monosynaptic reflex. Okay, let's look at something called the crossed extensor reflex. The crossed extensor reflex is the I just stepped on a Lego and I don't want to die reflex. That's the way I like to think about it. In the picture here, they've got a nail. The same thing would happen if you step on a nail or on a Lego, regardless. Here's how the crossed extensor reflex works. You step on something and it puts a whole lot of pressure on your foot. A lot of pressure feels like pain. So we're detecting pain information from what we step on. That sensory information goes up. Here we are, the dorsal root ganglion, into the dorsal horn. Now check this out. 1, 2, 3 different interneurons that sensory information is sent to. That sensory information goes to those 3 different interneurons because one of them is going to send a positive message to a flexor muscle. One of them is going to send a negative message to an extensor muscle on the side of the foot that we stepped on. Check out this interneuron though. This is also going to synapse with motor neurons. One of them that gets a positive message, one of them that gets a negative message to change what's going on with our muscles on the opposite side of the body. See, think about this. You step on something that's hurting you. You have to do 2 things. First, you have to lift up your foot. Second, you have to put down the other foot to make sure that you don't fall down and hurt yourself even more. When I look at the crossed extensor reflex, I have to respond to my stimulus with both sides of my body. The foot that was stepping on something needs to go up. The foot that is going to catch me needs to go down. No more standing on the nail, and I don't want to fall on the ground and hit it anymore. Let's use our words. The crossed extensor reflex. Let's start with the easy one. Cranial or spinal? What kind of reflex do I see from this picture? Cranial or spinal? Yep, this is another spinal reflex. Spinal reflex. I know that because I see a spinal cord. Is this monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Monosynaptic or polysynaptic? This is polysynaptic. How do I know, again, how do I know that this is a polysynaptic reflex? Yeah, I see an interneuron. Actually, I see multiple interneuron. I see lots of synapses. Yeah, the short answer, right, is that there's more than one synapse. There's all kinds of synapses in this reflex. So it's polysynaptic. There's more than one synapse. We've got all kinds of interneurons going on. The last word that we needed to know with our reflexes, is it ipsilateral or contralateral? Yeah, here's our example of a contralateral reflex. Contralateral. Because remember, that meant that the opposite side also responds. We have to respond one way with the side that was stepping on something, and the other way with the side that needs to catch us. We have motor information going out both sides of our spinal cord here. So spinal reflex, because I see the spinal cord. Polysynaptic, because there's more than one place that neurons talk to each other. And contralateral, because we send directions out the two sides. Again, on this one, my stimulus is going to be pain. So my stimulus, we'll add that to our list. Stimulus equals pain. That's the last thing for us to know. The crossed extensor reflex, another one activated by pain. Hey, so check this one out. This is the blinking reflex, and this is not a trick question. What do you think the blinking reflex makes you do? What would the blinking reflex make you do? Yeah, it makes you blink, right? This is a reflex that makes you blink when something touches your eye. Ooh, here, let's make a lab correlation. What was the name of the clear part in the front of your eye? What's the name of this clear part here? Yeah, this is the cornea. So the blinking reflex, when we talk about what activates this one, it's when something touches your cornea. Your cornea actually has sensory information inside of it. Yeah, so we can debate what we think this might be here. I'm hoping it's not a match. That would be really terrible if it was a match. To me, this kind of looks like a makeup brush. So I know, what the heck, Nicole, right? I hope it's not a match. Let's not put a match by our eyes. I think this looks like a makeup brush. Somebody got a little too excited with their liquid eyeliner, I guess, and they started to put some on their cornea. So regardless of whether it's a match or a makeup brush or a piece of dirt, could be dirt that flies into your eye. Whatever it is, something touches the cornea. The cornea detects the touch sensation, and that sensory information gets sent back here. Notice my little sensory neuron here gets sent back here, and it's processed, and it goes back out here to my motor neurons. Hey, we know this muscle, Orbicularis Oculi. Orbicularis Oculi. Does anyone remember what shape Orbicularis Oculi is? Yeah, it's that circle one, right? That circle that goes around the eyeball. So we're seeing the top part in the top eyelid and the bottom part in the bottom eyelid. So the blinking reflex is caused when we activate Orbicularis Oculi. That muscle that encircles the eye causes us to blink. When we look at the blinking reflex, do we think this one is a cranial reflex or a spinal reflex? Yeah, so we're right. We're voting in the chat that this is a cranial reflex. Cranial reflex. So when we're looking at this reflex, we may have no idea what all of this stuff is that's going on up here. But what we do know is that it is not the spinal cord. So whatever this is, and I'll tell you what it is actually. Here's the medulla oblongata down here. Here's the pons. Here's some of the stuff from inside the brain. You don't have to know what this is. You just have to know this isn't the spinal cord. So this is a cranial reflex because it's not a spinal reflex. We're going into the brain stem to process this thing. So we had a question in the chat asking if there was an interneuron in this reflex. If you look up close, can we tell? Is there an interneuron in this reflex? Yeah, you might have to look close on your paper to see. Notice how I've got my sensory neuron right here that's coming in, and I have a synapse. I can't zoom it in. You can zoom it in on your screen. But there's a synapse right here between the sensory neuron and this neuron right here. This neuron right here has a synapse with its neighbor right here. So I've got two synapses going on to send my information out. So this is a polysynaptic reflex. We are polysynaptic because if you look up close, there are two different synapses, two places where neurons talk to each other. So here's a polysynaptic reflex. It's a cranial reflex because we're not in the spinal cord. The last question then is if we are ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral or contralateral. Yeah, this is another one that is ipsilateral. Ipsilateral, because the side that the sensory information came in is the side that the motor information goes back out. Yeah, so if a piece of dust blows into your eye, the eye that starts watering, that immediately starts blinking, that's the same side as the side where the dirt is. Now, you might start, your eye might start watering on the other side too, but the primary side, the side that we see the sensory and motor information going in and out, is the same, ipsilateral. Yeah, so Gloria, when we say this is a cranial reflex, it's because what's going on right here, where the sensory information and the motor information are being processed at, is not the spinal cord. So that makes this a cranial reflex, because this is not the spinal cord where we're doing the processing. Yeah, and to answer Christina's question, touch is our stimulus for this one as well. This reflex actually is the reason why some people can't wear contacts. If their blinking reflex is really sensitive, they might feel the contact constantly touching their eyes. That's the way my husband is, or that's the way he says he would be. He won't try contacts because he thinks that he would be able to feel it on his eye all the time. So the blinking reflex is the one that would respond to, or it's the one that gets activated, right? If you ever put in a contact the wrong way, that would be what you would notice, the blinking reflex. Here's what I want to end us with today with these reflexes. I am going to give you on the exam, on exam number 4, a reflex that we have not talked about in class, a reflex that you have not seen before. I am going to ask you to identify these kind of things about it. Is it a cranial reflex? Is it a spinal reflex? Is it polysynaptic? Is it monosynaptic? Is it ipsilateral or is it contralateral? I know I'm warning you now because I am going to do that to you. We spent our class today going through looking at these pictures, figuring out how to do that. Because I'm going to give you a picture like this, not of a reflex we've seen, but of a different reflex. When you look at this picture, this is what we did together in class. We looked at this picture and we said, that's not the spinal cord. This must be a cranial reflex. Or we looked at this picture and we said, the information comes in and goes out the same side. This must be an ipsilateral reflex. Or we looked at this picture and said, hey, there's two synapses here. That means this is polysynaptic. I know that these words look and feel scary, but once you practice how we apply them to these pictures, it's actually not that hard. It's just using the pictures and pairing them with the words. So the stuff that we did in class today, going through and talking about each of these reflexes, how to use these pictures, that's what we're going to do on the exam with a new reflex. Yeah, so Nicole asked if the patellar reflex is the only monosynaptic reflex in the body. It's the only one I know of. That doesn't mean there aren't other monosynaptic reflexes, but the main one that we talk about as a monosynaptic reflex is the patellar reflex. So for the most part, and especially when you get that new reflex on the exam, If you see more than one synapse, which is most of them, it's going to be a polysynaptic reflex. Most of them are polysynaptic. So to answer your question more directly, Nicole, I believe it is the only monosynaptic. I could be wrong, but I believe it is the only one. We'll put it that way. All right, so in closing, as we are wrapping up our session today, remember that on Monday, we will do a lab final exam review, Monday at 9:30. I will make sure to post that time. We will mainly focus on how we can make action predictions. That'll be the goal. But if we have some time, we'll dive into cranial nerves a little bit. And then we will do another review the following week when the exam actually goes live. So that's our going forward. Don't forget about visible body assignments for special senses. That's due on Friday. So visible body due on Friday, Blackboard lab stuff due on Sunday. And then there's that review assignment available in Blackboard for the lab final exam as well. That'll stay open until after the lab exam. Yes, so Jacqueline, we will wrap up this lecture the week after Thanksgiving break, and then we'll move into the special senses lecture as well. So the rest of this will be covered then. Yep. All right, well, I am going to go ahead and shut off the recording. I'll stick around for a couple more minutes in the chat. Otherwise, have a great afternoon.